This is not a story of grand gestures, but of small, quiet revolutions of the heart. It is about the space a man builds around himself to keep the world out, and the woman who does not ask for entry, but teaches him, breath by careful breath, that the only true safety is in letting another soul in. It is a story of how a house becomes a home, not when the walls are built, but when two people inside finally learn the language of each other's silence. Caleb Stone's life was measured in straight lines. The neat rows of corn behind his homestead, the precise alignment of tools on his workshop wall, the single, uncreased pillow on his bed, his small cabin, set against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the frontier, was a bastion of order in a world of chaos. Each day was a repetition of the last. Rise before dawn, work the land until dusk, eat a solitary meal at his rough-hewn table, and clean his rifle by the light of a single flickering lamp. The silence in his home was a physical presence, a weight he had grown accustomed to. It was the silence of a man who spoke little and was spoken to even less. People in the nearby town saw him as stoic, severe even, a man whose hands were competent with an axe or a plow, but whose heart was fallow ground. They were not wrong, but they were not entirely right. His solitude was a fortress, built stone by stone after a loss that had taught him the devastating cost of love. He protected himself with routine, his moral code a simple one: mind his own business, owe no man, and expect nothing. He had buried his desire for belonging so deep, he had almost forgotten it was there. His loneliness was a quiet, orderly thing, a bed made for one, a single cup hanging by the hearth, a house too silent, waiting for a life it had never known. The knock on his door came late one summer evening, a sound so alien it felt like a violation of the deep-seated quiet. He opened it to find Marshall Thompson on his porch, and standing slightly behind him, a woman. She was wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her face smudged with dust, but her back was straight and her gaze was level. There was a wild, proud stillness about her, like a hawk resting on a branch, poised and aware. "Caleb," the marshal said, his voice low, "this is Nita. She's in some trouble." The trouble had a name. Deputy Harding, a man whose badge was a shield for his predatory nature. Harding had claimed Nita was his ward, a convenient legal fiction to control her and the small plot of land she had inherited. She had fled him, seeking sanctuary with the only authority she thought she could trust. The marshal, a good but weary man, knew his deputy's character, and knew the law offered little protection for a lone Apache woman against a white man's claim. "Harding will have her back by morning, legally or otherwise," Thompson explained. "There's only one way to give her a protection the law has to recognize. A marriage of convenience. A name on a piece of paper." Caleb looked at the woman, Nita. He saw the defiant fear in her eyes, the fierce pride that refused to break. He saw a survivor. His own carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered, but his moral code, the one buried deep beneath the scar tissue, would not let him turn her away. "All right," was all he said. The marshal was the witness. The vows were plain, stripped of all poetry, a transaction of necessity. Then the marshal left, and Caleb was alone with his wife. He gestured to the small, spare room. "You can sleep there. The door has a lock." She looked at him, her perception sharp, seeing the honorable man behind the stoic facade. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That night, the silence in Caleb's house changed. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the tense, breathing silence of proximity. From his room, he could hear the whisper of her movements, the soft sound of the lock clicking into place. A second lamp was lit in his house, and its soft glow through the crack under her door was the first flicker of warmth in his cold, orderly world. The first days of their arrangement were a study in quiet observation. Nita moved through his space with a deliberate grace that respected the order he had built. She did not chatter or intrude. She watched and learned the rhythms of his life, and then, slowly, she began to add her own. On the second morning, he came into the kitchen to find 2 tin mugs set on the table, not one. Steam rose from both. He said nothing, but the simple gesture landed in his chest with an unexpected weight. He had not shared a morning cup of coffee with another person in a decade. She kept to her room for much of the day, but when she emerged, it was with purpose. He watched from the corner of his eye as she explored the small homestead. He saw her run a hand over the rough bark of the oak tree, her head tilted as if listening to it. He saw her crumble the soil from his fields between her fingers, her expression thoughtful. She possessed a deep, innate understanding of the land, one that his plows and fences could never achieve. She was a woman who belonged to this place in a way he never would. He was a cultivator. She was a kindred spirit to the wildness he was trying to tame. One afternoon, he returned from the fields to find one of his work shirts, the one with the torn sleeve, lying on his bed. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of small, impossibly neat stitches, the thread a shade darker than the worn fabric. It was an act of service, a wordless communication in a language he understood. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was stronger than the original. That evening, he returned the gesture. He noticed the handle of the bucket she used to draw water from the well was splintered. He took it to his workshop, and by the light of his lantern, sanded it smooth, rubbing it with oil until it felt like silk in his hand. He left it by the well for her to find in the morning. They were building a bridge between them, not with words, but with acts of quiet mutual care. It was a fragile structure, built on the foundation of a shared roof and a common enemy, but it was a beginning. He started to see her not as an intrusion, but as a presence that made the silent house feel less empty. Her quiet humming as she worked, the scent of wild herbs she gathered and dried, the simple fact of another beating heart in his home, it was all slowly, inexorably, breaking down the walls of his fortress. Trust, Caleb learned, was not a decision, but a slow, careful accretion of moments. It was built in the space between heartbeats, in gestures offered and accepted without comment. He began to leave the door to his workshop open when he was inside, a silent invitation. She, in turn, began to leave her own door unlocked. They fell into a rhythm of shared domestic tasks, a silent dance of 2 solitary people learning to move in tandem. He had a small patch of land he'd always meant to turn into a vegetable garden, but had never found the heart to start. One morning he found her there, her hands deep in the soil, patiently removing rocks and weeds. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply fetched his shovel and started turning the earth beside her. They worked all day, side by side, the only sounds the scrape of his shovel and the soft thud of rocks being tossed aside. He showed her how to properly bank the soil into rows. She showed him how to read the clouds, predicting the afternoon rain with an accuracy that startled him. Her knowledge was woven from observation and tradition, a wisdom that made his almanac seem like a child's book. It was in these shared tasks that micro-intimacies began to bloom. Once, while he was showing her how to sharpen the blade of a hoe, her hand slipped. The newly honed edge sliced a shallow cut across her palm. She hissed, drawing her hand back. Before he could think, he reached for her, his hand hovering in the air between them, a breath away from her skin. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough. Her eyes, dark and deep, searched his. He saw her register the question, the respect inherent in it. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. His touch, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. His large, calloused fingers were infinitely careful as he inspected the wound. The warmth of her skin against his was a jolt, a sudden, sharp awareness that sent a tremor through his carefully controlled world. He led her inside, his hand still holding hers, and washed the cut with water from the basin. He found a clean strip of linen and wrapped it around her hand, his movements precise and focused. He did not let go until the bandage was tied. When he finally released her, the absence of her touch was a palpable loss. From that day on, something shifted. The space between them, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now hummed with a different kind of energy. It was the low, steady burn of longing, a quiet yearning for a closeness that was slowly, carefully being earned. The careful distance they had maintained began to feel less like a boundary and more like a void. The longing that had been a quiet undercurrent was now a tangible presence in the small cabin, a silent third occupant in their marriage of convenience. It lived in the lingering glances across the supper table, the way their hands brushed when passing a tool, the shared breath in a narrow hallway. Caleb found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, the soft cadence a counterpoint to the steady beat of his own heart. He started talking more, not much, but enough. He would tell her about the state of the corn, or a hawk he saw circling overhead. She, in turn, would share small things, pointing out the tracks of a fox near the chicken coop, or the particular sweetness of the wild berries she had found. These were not deep confessions, but they were threads, tiny filaments of connection being woven between them. The true shift came one evening during a summer rainstorm. The rain fell in hard, steady sheets, drumming against the roof and turning the world outside into a blur of gray. The sound filled the cabin, pressing in on them, making the small space feel even more intimate. They sat at the table, the lamp casting a warm golden circle of light around them. She was mending another of his shirts, her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the blue-black sheen of her hair. He was oiling a piece of leather tack, the familiar rhythmic work of balm to his restless energy. He watched her nimble fingers, the way the needle flashed in and out of the fabric. "Nita," he said, her name soft in the rain-filled quiet. She looked up, her hands stilling. Her eyes in the lamplight were deep and searching. He had never said her name just to say it before. It had always been a preface to a question or a request. This was different. This was an acknowledgement. A small, unguarded smile touched her lips, a rare and beautiful thing that made his chest ache. "Caleb," she replied, her voice just as soft, a mirror to his own. In that single shared moment, the pretense of their arrangement fell away. They were no longer just a protector and a survivor, a landlord and a tenant. They were a man and a woman, sitting together in a small house while a storm raged outside, and the quiet, desperate longing that had been growing between them finally found its voice. He wanted to reach across the table and touch her, to trace the line of her jaw, to feel the reality of her, but he did not. The trust they had built was too precious, too fragile. It had to be her choice. The moment passed, but it left an indelible mark. The air was different, charged with unspoken possibility. The guardedness was gone, replaced by a yearning so profound it was a physical presence in the room. The rainstorm broke the summer heat, but it left behind a thick, humid air that clung to the skin and made the nights heavy and still. The small cabin, once a refuge, now felt close, the thin walls seeming to breathe with the unspoken tension between them. Caleb had taken to sleeping on a pallet on the floor of the main room, insisting she keep the bed. He told himself it was for propriety, but he knew it was a self-imposed penance, a way to manage the fierce, protective desire that kept him awake long into the night, listening to the soft sound of her breathing from the other room. He could feel her restlessness as well. The quiet harmony of their days was now underscored by a shared, unspoken yearning. The decision to deepen their closeness, when it came, was initiated by her. It was another hot, oppressive night, the air thick and motionless. Caleb lay on his pallet, staring into the darkness, when he heard the soft creak of her door. He saw her silhouette in the dim moonlight, filtering through the window. "Caleb?" Her voice was a whisper in the dark. He sat up. "Is something wrong?" "I cannot sleep," she said, her voice steady, but he could sense the vulnerability behind the words. The ... The quiet is too loud tonight, he understood. It was the kind of quiet that reminded you of all the things you were missing. She did not move closer, but stood by the door, granting him the space to accept or decline what she was implicitly offering. This was not a seduction. It was a request for comfort, for the solace of another human presence in a lonely dark. It was a test of the trust they had built, a profound gesture of faith in his honor. He could hear the careful consent check in her hesitation, the agency in her choice to come to him. "The floor is hard," he said, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. He rose and went to the hearth, adding a small log to the embers, bringing a soft, warm glow to the room. He turned back to her. "You can take the bed. I will stay here. I will keep you warm." It was a simple promise, a vow in plain speech. She looked from him to the large bed that dominated the main room, his bed. "Only if you want," she said, her voice barely audible. The words were a question and an answer all at the same time. "I want," he said, and the admission felt like a confession, a truth he had been holding back for weeks. He did not move to the bed. He simply took his blanket from the pallet and laid it at the foot of the bed, then returned to his spot by the hearth, giving her the illusion of privacy as she settled in. He lay down, his back to her, listening to the soft rustle of the sheets. The scent of her, of rain and wild herbs, filled his senses. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and their synchronized breathing. Then he felt a light touch on his shoulder. He turned his head to see her kneeling on the floor beside him. In her hand, she held out the corner of the heavy quilt from the bed. It was an invitation, an honest vow to remain. He took the quilt, and together they lay in the warm, firelit darkness, not touching, but sharing the same space, the same air, the same profound, comforting warmth. The fragile peace they had forged in the quiet of the homestead was not destined to last. Deputy Harding was a man who did not easily surrender what he considered his property. He arrived one morning unannounced, his horse trampling the edge of the garden Nita had so carefully tended. He dismounted with an air of entitled ownership, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Caleb met him on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. He was not armed, but his stance was an unmistakable barrier. "Harding," Caleb said, his voice a low warning. "This is my property. You're not welcome here." Harding smirked, his eyes flicking past Caleb to where Nita had appeared in the shadows of the room, her face impassive. "Now, Caleb, is that any way to treat an officer of the law? I'm just here on a welfare check, making sure your bride is settling in." The way he said the word bride was an insult, a clear insinuation that their marriage was a sham. "She is fine," Caleb stated, his body a shield. "Now leave." "I don't think so," Harding said, taking a step forward. "There are questions about the legality of this union. An Apache woman can't just enter into a contract without the approval of her legal guardian. And that's me." He was using the law as a weapon, twisting it to serve his own dishonorable ends. He was the predator, a stark foil to Caleb's quiet, respectful protection. Nita stepped forward, moving to stand beside Caleb. She did not cower or hide behind him. She faced Harding directly, her chin high. "You are not my guardian," she said, her voice clear and cold. "You are my jailer. I am this man's wife." Harding's eyes narrowed, his gaze filled with a possessive fury. "We'll see what the circuit judge has to say about that. A piece of paper won't protect you forever, girl. And you, Stone, you'd do well to remember who holds the power in this county." He turned and left, mounting his horse and riding away, leaving a trail of bruised plants and palpable menace in his wake. The social pressure had arrived, threatening to tear apart the delicate world they had built. The confrontation left a chill in the air, a tension that lingered long after Harding was gone. At evening, the silence in the cabin was heavy with unspoken fears. The threat was no longer distant. It was on their doorstep. The deputy's visit shattered the illusion of safety they had built within the four walls of the cabin. The social stakes were now terrifyingly real. That night, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that even the familiar routines of supper and chores could not dispel. After they had cleared the table, Caleb lit a second lamp, a silent acknowledgement that this was not a night for shadows. He sat opposite Nita, the table between them feeling like a vast, empty plain. "He will not stop," Caleb said, breaking the silence. It was a statement of fact, not of defeat. "You need to tell me everything. If I am to protect you, I need to know what he holds over you." Nita looked at him, her gaze searching his face in the warm lamplight. She saw the steady resolve in his eyes, the unwavering honor. This was the moment where their partnership would either solidify or fracture. She took a breath and began to speak, her voice low but strong. She told him of her father, a white trader, and her Apache mother, and how, after they had passed, the law had declared her a ward of the county, placing her under Harding's control. She spoke of his coercive advances, the way he used her legal status as a cage, promising her freedom in exchange for submission. Fleeing to the marshal had been her last, desperate act of agency. Her story was one of resilience, of a proud woman fighting for her autonomy in a world determined to strip it from her. When she finished, the silence that fell was one of profound shared understanding. Caleb felt a surge of protective fury, so intense it made his hands clench into fists under the table. Then he did something he had not done in years. He spoke of himself. He told her about his wife, Sarah, and their infant son, taken by fever 5 years prior. He spoke of the guilt that had haunted him, the feeling that he had failed in his most fundamental duty as a protector. He confessed that his orderly solitude was not a choice, but a penance, a fortress built to ensure he would never feel that kind of loss again. "I failed to protect my family," he said, his voice raw with a grief he had never before put into words. "I will not fail to protect you." The confessions, offered in the intimate glow of the lamp, opened the emotional doors between them. They were no longer just allies in a practical arrangement. They were two survivors, each bearing their own scars, who had found a kindred soul in the most unlikely of circumstances. Nita reached across the table, her hand covering his clenched fist. Her touch was not one of pity, but of strength, of shared understanding. "You are a good man, Caleb Stone," she whispered. It was an absolution he had not known he was seeking. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. In that moment, a new vow was made, not of convenience, but of the heart. They would face whatever came next, not as two separate people, but as one. Harding did not wait long to make his move. 2 days later, a formal summons arrived, delivered by a nervous stable boy from town. It was a petition to the circuit judge, who was due to arrive in a week's time, to have the marriage between Caleb Stone and Nita annulled. The legal grounds were flimsy, but insidious. Coercion on Caleb's part, and Nita's legal status as a ward of the county, deeming her incapable of entering into a valid contract. Harding was using her Apache heritage as a weapon against her, painting her as an uncivilized savage who needed his firm, white hand to guide her. The document was a declaration of war, a social battle to be fought not with guns, but with prejudice and lies. The week leading up to the judge's arrival was a period of tense preparation. They did not speak much of the upcoming hearing. Instead, they focused on the work of the homestead, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythms of their shared life. There was a new deliberateness to their interactions, a heightened awareness of the fragility of their time together. Every shared meal, every quiet evening, felt precious, shadowed by the threat of separation. Caleb spent his evenings in his workshop, but not on farm repairs. He was meticulously carving a small, intricate object from a piece of seasoned oak. He did not tell Nita what it was, and she did not ask. It was his own silent way of preparing, of channeling his fear and his hope into something tangible. Nita, for her part, grew even quieter, her stillness containing a formidable strength. She would spend hours in the small garden they had built together, her hands in the earth, as if drawing strength from it. One afternoon, Caleb found her sharpening his axe, her movements fluid and efficient. She tested the edge with her thumb, her expression focused. When she was done, she offered it to him hilt first. It was a gesture of profound trust and respect, an acknowledgment of his role as her protector, but also a statement of her own part in their shared defense. She was not a passive victim waiting to be rescued. She was a partner, preparing her champion for the coming fight. The night before the hearing, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. They sat at the table, the legal summons lying between them like a snake. "I will not be a ward again," Nita said, her voice low but fierce. "I will not go back to him." Caleb reached across the table and covered the document with his hand, obscuring Harding's venomous words. "You won't have to," he said, his voice a steady, unbreakable promise. "Tomorrow, we show him what a true partnership looks like." The circuit judge held his hearings in the town's small, stuffy meeting hall. The room was crowded, the air thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and cheap tobacco. Harding stood near the judge's makeshift bench, smug and confident, flanked by two of his cronies. He presented his case with a sickening veneer of civic concern, portraying Caleb as a lonely opportunist who had taken advantage of a vulnerable, simple-minded native woman. He used her heritage as proof of her supposed incompetence, his words a vile cocktail of racism and entitlement. Caleb and Nita sat together on a bench at the front. He was wearing his clean, mended shirt. She was wearing a simple, dark dress, her hair braided neatly down her back. They were a portrait of quiet dignity. When it was Caleb's turn to speak, he rose. He did not shout or posture. He spoke in plain, direct terms. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and clear, filling the silent room. "Mr. Harding speaks of contracts and legal status. I am a simple man. I speak of honor." He looked directly at Harding. "There is no honor in what he is doing." Then he turned his gaze to Nita, and the entire room seemed to fade away. His voice softened. "This woman came to me seeking sanctuary. I offered her my name and my protection, as any decent man would. But in the weeks she has been in my home, she has given me far more. She has brought life back to a place that was just a house. She is my partner. She is my wife." The judge, an old, discerning man with eyes that had seen the best and worst of human nature, then turned to Nita. "Mrs. Stone, do you have anything to say?" Nita stood. She did not look at the judge or at the crowd. She looked at Caleb. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried a strength that silenced every whisper in the room. "I was a runaway," she began, her words measured and deliberate. "I was running from a man who saw me as property. A cage he called protection." She then met the judge's gaze. "This man," she said, gesturing to Caleb, "has never once treated me as anything less than his equal. He has never laid a hand on me without asking. He has never raised his voice. He has built a home, and he has invited me to share it." She took a step closer to Caleb, and in a clear, unwavering voice that every person in that room could hear, she made her own vow. "I choose him. I am his wife, not because of a piece of paper, but because I choose to be. If you make me his wife in the eyes of your law, I swear I'll never let another man touch me. I have made my choice." She reached out and took Caleb's hand. He stood with her, their fingers lacing together in a public, unbreakable bond. The partnership, forged in quiet domesticity, was now declared before the world. The judge looked at their joined hands, at the quiet strength that radiated from them, and then at Harding's sputtering, impotent rage. He banged his gavel once. "Petition for annulment denied. The marriage stands." The walk back to the wagon was a blur. The tension of the hearing drained away, leaving a quiet, profound sense of peace in its wake. They had faced the predator and won, not with violence, but with the simple, unassailable truth of their bond. They did not speak on the ride back to the homestead. There were no words for the emotions that flowed between them: relief, triumph, and a deep, tender vulnerability. The world looked different, the colors of the prairie richer, the sky wider. They were returning not just to a house, but to their home. As they unhitched the horse, Caleb noticed a small bloody scratch on the back of Nita's hand, where she must have scraped it against the bench in the tense moments of the hearing. He said nothing, but after he had tended to the horse, he met her in the kitchen. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the familiar, peaceful space. He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over the small wound. "Come," he said, his voice soft. He led her to the sink and pumped cool, clean water into the basin. Just as he had done before, he carefully washed the scratch, his touch impossibly gentle. This time, there was no hesitation, no question needed. This simple act of aftercare, of tending, was their new language. It was an affirmation of their public vows, a quiet, intimate sealing of their victory. That evening, a celebratory mood, serene and heartfelt, filled the cabin. Caleb took 2 thick cuts of salted pork from the larder, a rare indulgence. He cooked them in a skillet, the rich, savory smell filling the small kitchen. Nita made a fresh batch of corn bread, her movements deft and sure. They worked together seamlessly, a comfortable domestic ballet. They ate at the table, the food tasting better than any meal they had had before. It was a feast of quiet celebration. After they had eaten, as twilight settled over the plains, Caleb went to his workshop. He returned with the small object he had been carving all week. He placed it in her hand. It was a bird, a hawk, its wings slightly spread as if about to take flight. The detail was exquisite, every feather carved with a loving precision. "The hawk sees everything," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It is strong, and it is free. It reminds me of you." Nita's fingers closed around the carving, the smooth, warm wood a comforting weight in her palm. It was a token, a symbol of his devotion, a promise of a future where she would always be free. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. There were no more words needed. He was her protector, and she was his heart. Their partnership, tested by social pressure and affirmed by public choice, was now settling into its true and final form, a quiet, devoted, and unbreakable love. In the weeks and months that followed, the homestead transformed. The straight, rigid lines of Caleb's old life softened and curved, blending with the graceful, resilient patterns of Nita's. Their shared routines became a tapestry of mutual care and quiet affection. The garden they had started together flourished under her intuitive hand, providing them with more than enough to eat and to trade in town. The house, once a silent shell, was now filled with the low murmur of their conversations, with their soft humming, with the simple, profound sound of a shared life being lived. Their intimacy grew not in grand declarations, but in the accumulation of thousands of small, tender moments. It was in the way he would bring her the first wildflower of spring, leaving it in a small gloss on the windowsill. It was in the way she would save him the warmest spot by the fire on a cool evening. It was in the shared smiles over a clumsy stitch, the comfortable silence as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. The bed in the spare room remained empty. They shared his bed now, their nights a landscape of quiet closeness, of shared warmth and gentle breath. Their desire for each other, once a dangerous, unspoken undercurrent, was now a safe and steady flame, tended with careful consent and mutual reverence. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Nita rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. His arm came around her, holding her close. "This place," she said softly, looking out at the fields bathed in the golden light of dusk, "it needs a name." Caleb was silent for a long moment, his gaze following hers. He thought of the lonely, empty man he had been, and the profound, healing love he had found. He thought of her, his fierce, gentle hawk who had taught him how to live again. "They call this the high plains," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it was never high until you came. It was just empty." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We'll call it Sparrow's Rest, a safe place to land." Nita smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held all the promise of their future. "I like that," she whispered. Their future was not a grand adventure, but a quiet promise. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of tending a garden together, of growing old in a house that was finally, truly, a home. The stoic protector and the resilient survivor had found their family, a found family of two, their bond sealed not by a legal document, but by a carved hawk, a named home, and the quiet, unbreakable vow of two hearts that had found their rest in each other.